A little bit nervous with the recording. Right. So as I was saying, private sector investment into mini grids, at least in literature, is found to be kind of a barrier for scaling up that solution for electrification in Kenya. Is that something that you can agree with, or?
Okay, as someone who's been involved in energy access since the beginning,
Yeah.
I came as a Peace Corps volunteer,
Right.
and I put solar on my school in 1985,
Mm-hmm.
and I formed a company in 92, and I trained solar technicians between 85 and 87. My technicians installed $1 million worth of solar home systems in 3 years. So I know a little bit about the sector,
Right.
and I've been part of the sector since day one.
Right.
Um, I'm not a member of the church. My belief is that if you look at, so let's talk about PAYGO.
Mm-hmm.
Mobisol came in. They were going to change the world. They're insolvent.
Right.
Um, this week, Solar Kiosk declared insolvency.
Mm-hmm.
2017, MCOPA, which had received over $100 million of investment, was restructured.
Yeah.
They're not doing well. Off-grid electric targeted that they were going to get 1 million customers in Tanzania. They now have less than 50,000 customers, and there's no office in Arusha anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when they had 8, 10 expat people and maybe 50 to 100 full-time staff.
Yeah.
Now they've got nothing.
Yeah.
And we could go on. Phoenix in Uganda has a few 100,000 customers. They were bought by Engie.
Mm-hmm.
Engie is a big international. It's the biggest energy supplier in France, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
and they're quite happy to make losses so that they can get into the African market and they can
Right.
get into this game. So when we talk about energy access, there is no profitability. It's a losing game. So unless we so none of the investors in any of these PAYGO players, and we can talk about Power Hive, we can talk about Power Gen,
Mm-hmm.
we can talk about Standard Microgrids, we can talk about all these so-called mini grid players. They're all startups.
Yeah.
What they're doing right now is they're going to conferences, they're talking to impact investors, and they're saying, give us money, give us money, give us money. And it's bullshit. It's bullshit.
Okay. Yeah.
You quote that, but it, it, they, they're virtually all expat social entrepreneurs
Mm-hmm.
who think they know the answer for Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been there, I've done that, and so what's my view? My view is before we even consider the policy environment, because I think we need to get to that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and tariffs.
Right.
Before we even consider that, what we need to say is, and I'm sorry if this is going to screw up but please
Tell me.
take this or not.
Yeah.
What we are doing as donors and as people investing in Africa, in Germany, solar went to the middle class. The richest people in Germany bought solar systems and they installed 1 million solar system. Right now, this week, they had 54% of their energy was coming from renewable. Most of it was wind,
Mm-hmm.
but at least 8-10% was coming from solar. California, the same thing. Middle class, my parents have a 30 kilowatt solar system on top of their house in California. So what are we doing in the West? We're saying let's do large or distributed, medium-sized household commercial solar systems for middle class, and let's incentivize them, let them write it off their taxes,
Mm-hmm.
or give them strong PPA agreements,
Mm-hmm.
and then large megawatt scale, large scale systems. So you could say in most countries it's anywhere from half to 90, 10%, 10% distributed, 90% megawatt scale. But in every one of these countries, the focus has been on-grid solar. So it's Africa, where the donors have said for the last 15 years, solar and mini grids are going to be for the poor.
Right.
So the premise that we're following up, and you can read my article that I recently posted, which has raised a little bit of a stink.
Okay.
But the whole premise of saying we're going to try out all these technologies in off-grid areas,
Yeah.
is totally wrong.
Right.
What we should be doing is saying, all right, a mini grid is a great thing. It's a great technology. Batteries, solar, wind, inverters, sophisticated payment methods. This is all great stuff. This technology needs to be in Africa. No one disagrees with that. But why are we sending them to the poorest towns? Turkana,
Right.
Mandera, the areas where nobody can afford to pay for it because there is no economic development.
Right.
So what you're doing is saying, okay, let's do a 15 kilowatt solar system. Cost of a 15 kilowatt solar system, $4 a watt, $60,000. Let's put a $60,000 system in a town where the best we're going to be able to do is get 300 connections. Most often you see 100 connections. It's very rare when you see more than 500 connections in a small mini grid.
Right.
So we're going to do 300 connections, and we're going to force these social entrepreneurs, and you're young, you're Superman, you can do anything. Give you $10 million, $1 million, you can do everything.
Sure.
No, this is what Sam Slaughter, Sam Doobie, the guys of Standard Microgrid, they're Superman.
Yeah.
They're going to solve all these problems, and technology is going to do it.
Right.
PayGo, database, PayGo. Everyone who came before them, oh well, those are old school people. We have now resolved it because we come from Silicon Valley, and we know how to use Google data, so we can do it. The technology is here. We have all this great kit, so we're going to solve the problems. I was hired with a USTDA contract to look at 20 sites for Standard Microgrid.
Right.
They're not going to make any money.
No.
No, I'm sorry, don't
No,
quote me there.
no, I won't.
But the sites that I went to are all traditional, dirt poor rural areas with no cash economy.
Right.
One harvest a year.
Right.
You go in the town and there's 5 shops that are open in a town of 2,000 people. 5 shops.
Right.
And there's nothing in the shops.
Right. Yeah.
So what we're doing, so if we take a step back before we get to tariffs and subsidies,
Yeah.
what we're doing is we're saying, okay, private sector, MCOPA, you go and solve this problem with your new technology, which is solar lanterns or solar home systems in the case of Mobisol,
Yeah.
or mini and microgrids in the case of PowerHive and Standard Microgrid and PowerGen.
But don't you think there's a difference between what MCOPA does and a mini grid can do in terms of power output and the effect that can have on the local economy? I mean, MCOPA, they have like the tiny little home solar system. What can you do with that electricity? You can't do too much. Right?
Okay, Brian of the CEO of Standard Microgrid,
Yeah.
he spares no, he criticizes off-grid standalone solar. Well, how come there's, in Kenya alone, probably 2 million off-grid solar systems?
Right.
So they're doing something right, and they're not mostly PayGo. They are mostly over-the-counter gray market systems.
Right.
You got to read my article.
I will.
But if you Google all this stuff, what you get is you get the articles about off-grid electric. You get the articles about MCOPA. You get the articles about Azuri. You get the articles about the super social entrepreneurs that have Silicon Valley money or Berlin money or London money. You don't get the articles about the Kikuyu or Indian traders that are operating out of small hardware stores on Mount Kenya. You don't get those articles.
No.
So the fact that there's 2 million solar home systems and there's a handful I mean, I'm trying to do mini grids. That's how you found me.
Yeah.
I have a different model, and we can come to that. But so your question to me is, isn't it better that a client would have uh, uh, 2 kilowatt hours a day rather than 200 watt hours a day,
Exactly.
or 50 watt hours a
Yeah.
day, which is what the MCOPA small system provides.
Right.
And that's a very valid question, and that's the reason, when given a choice, most rural Kenyans would go for a grid connection over a solar home system, hands down.
Mhm.
But the reason they go for the solar home system is because the grid connections they can't afford. First of all, there's no way we can distribute the powers, no matter what the government is doing. The government's just dumped, $1 billion into subsidizing the grid extension.
Yeah.
Now, mini grids, are mini grids any better? Well, mini grids are more expensive, and the places where, according to, in Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, where the World Bank, where the donors are saying that the mini grid should go, are the farthest away, because by definition they're out of reach.
You can't extend the main grid.
Yeah, so they're saying, okay, these areas are where we're going to do mini grids. And if you go to those areas, you find zero economic activity. So what are we trying to do? Well, we're giving consultancies to groups like Energy for Access and all of these NGOs and these overpriced consultants. I'm an overpriced consultant. I'm a totally overpriced consultant. I understand that. To do productive use, to create productive use. What did we do in the U.S. when we invented NRECA in the 30s?
We subsidize it.
We subsidized the electricity, and then we brought electric milk machines, we brought refrigerators, we bought electric farm machines, and we financed them.
Right.
So that was productive use, and that worked. But U.S. economy was growing in double digit per year. People were leaving the rural areas at the same time. So there was so you had 80% of the population, or 90% of the population in the city subsidizing 5 or 10% in the rural areas.
Right.
Here, you've got, really in the urban areas, at best you have 5 or 10% of the population that can afford to subsidize the 70% or 60% in the unconnected areas. And then in the super remote areas where we're saying we should do mini grids. So we shouldn't be having an argument about mini grids and solar home systems. It should be a cloud. So if you put a mini grid here and you set up your mini grid, well, there's going to be solar systems.
Right.
And this guy should be using the very same PAYGO model to supply this guy over here with a solar system, or a briefcase with a lithium-ion battery, which you can bring back here to charge.
Right.
And there's your business model.
Right.
So that's my opinion. So that, just the first part of our discussion, and I've given you an hour because it's Friday, but first part of the discussion is that somebody needs to say, can off-grid solutions, be they grid or grid, mini grids, or solar home systems or PICO systems, can any of them survive without subsidy?
Right.
And my premise to that is every single grid connection in Africa is subsidized on the order of $500 to $1,000. Peri-urban Africa.
Right.
That's with World Bank loans. And now what we're trying to do is we're telling the mini grids and the PICO and the MCOPAs of the world, you got to do this commercially.
Right. No subsidies.
For the poorest people.
Yeah.
Do they have equity? I mean, are they members of the country? If the peri-urban people are getting a $500 subsidy, and even people in Kibera
Right.
are getting a $500 subsidy, And that money isn't going to them, that's going to contractors and politically connected wheeler dealers that are getting the jobs to
Yeah.
put up, I mean, who makes the concrete poles in Kenya? Well, it's Ruto.
Okay.
You know who that is?
No, I don't. Yeah.
He's a deputy president.
Okay. Yeah.
He has a company that makes the concrete poles. So, but leaving that aside and leaving corruption aside, the central question that should appear somewhere in your thesis is, if billions of dollars are being spent to extend the grid for peri-urban and urban connections, why should the rural connections be 100% commercial and unsubsidized?
Right. Yeah.
That to me is because these are the areas where there isn't any economic development. What you got me started on the discussion,
Yeah.
what got the discussion is saying, well, shouldn't we put up a mini grid because having a mini grid there doesn't mean that someone's going to wave a magic wand and there's going to be a productive use. If you happen to be near a forest, someone can put up a sawmill and turn trees into chairs.
Mm-hmm.
With a mill, yeah? That would be great. But if you're in Marsabit, and the best you've got is camels, well, maybe you can make camel milk and camel meat, and you can put it in a refrigerator. But it ain't that easy.
No, of course. It's not going to prop up overnight, just if you put a mini grid out there.
You aren't going to create economic activity overnight, and the experiences we had with rural electrification in the U.S. and other countries is that it takes a significant amount of investment. When Enrica was sending people out, they had finance companies that were going out and financing the equipment that was being sold.
Right.
So someone could get a milking machine,
right,
with finance.
Right.
So there was a huge there was a not very corrupt plan for the 90% to finance the 10%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it worked.
Right.
And that happened in Europe too. Here, none of these dollar a day dirt poor rural people have the money to set up a business, even if the town that they're living in had the economic activity that could support that business.
Right.
Right?
Right, yeah.
So in America, you had cities developing markets for milk, markets for agricultural products, developing very quickly, markets for meat. But here, these very distant, unconnected, there's no roads to a lot of these places. So when you try and put a mini grid in a place where there isn't a good road connection, well, maybe we should be thinking about putting the road in first before we do the mini grid.
Right.
So my point is, your thesis is talking about the technical options when there's a whole issue of how do we develop a community economically.
Right.
The mini grid is not going to be the waved magic wand. It's what a lot of development planners, including local politicians and World Bank officials who are trying to push $100 million loans through, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants power.
Right.
Everybody wants power. So whether it's mini grid or a grid connection, they don't really want solar systems so much because they see very clearly that as you said, that the solar home system ain't gonna give me, it ain't gonna power my compressor.
Right, or your, sewing machine or something like that.
Yeah. So I'm sorry I've dominated. Maybe you want I'm not listening to your questions.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But another thing that I think, back to your original point, that a mini grid is not going to spur economic activity out of nowhere. Of course not. But coupled with other initiatives and incentives, don't you think that having access to kind of a higher output of electricity would be a prerequisite?
Okay. So
Eventually.
Here's my plan for mini grid development in Africa. first, my belief is that we should be putting the mini grids in places where there is already economic
Right.
development in towns.
Right.
Especially in towns where electricity is really is really expensive and really weak, like in Nigeria,
Mm-hmm.
where you have weak grids.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing we should be doing is using donor finance to get industry in urban and peri-urban areas to because Africa needs to transition to distributed green energy.
Right.
So we're talking wind, solar, biomass power, hydropower, whatever it is. So if we're going to do this transition, we need to get these places. So number one for me would be urban, peri-urban, in areas where the markets already exist.
Mm-hmm.
And this enables us to test the technology. It enables us to train the people who are going to run the technology, and it also starts to involve the local traders in these technologies.
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. Number two is anchor loads. Anchor loads are really important for the really remote areas.
Right.
So anchor loads could be telecom. Anchor loads could be public institutions or water supplies. So if, for example, we had a small town and someone who's putting in a mini-R microgrid said, okay, I'm going to get a 10-year supply contract to power the schools and the clinics here. And instead of the government putting the panels on top of the roofs of the schools, which is what they do in Kenya and a lot of World Bank programs, they said, okay, we're going to wire the school 240, and we're going to pay a mini grid provider. So they could be public institutions. And it could also be water supply.
Yeah.
So the anchor loads could be telecom. They could be public service, hospitals, clinics, schools, police posts, water supply points.
Mm-hmm.
So now government, the World Bank instead could or the donor could put the money into an account in the county and say, okay, we're going to put this money for 5 years into a fund, and we're going to have Deloitte manage this money, and every month, based on how much electricity was provided, and making sure that this electricity was provided, we're going to now pay this mini grid to provide these services.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you avoid the schools getting a dump from a procurement dump where someone puts in solar panels on the roof of a health center and a bunch of batteries, and then 2 years later the batteries are all dead, and then you got panels and batteries, nothing's working.
Right.
So basically you're giving a mini grid operator a load to start with.
Right. Yeah.
So now that's two. Number three could be productive use centers. So yeah, now you're talking, okay, what are the productive use? Well, it depends on what the value chain. Is it a dairy value chain? Is it a meat value chain? Is it a tourism value chain? Is it a fishing value chain? Is it a maize, wheat value chain? And then you say, okay, we're gonna power the things in the town that serve that value chain.
Right. Yeah.
And you start with productive use centers, and you really have a little bit of intelligent planning on how to do that.
Right.
So how do you do that? Well, we don't have the answers, but maybe the person who's running the microgrid as part of their business model sets up a productive use center, and they make that part of their business, because they say, okay, we've got 6 different types of productive use based on a survey of the country.
Right.
At the coast, we put in a refrigerator